What is up, everybody? This is Andre Joseph, AJ Epics Productions, and we're back with the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast for this brand new fall season. I needed that rejuvenation, guys, because the summer has been very busy, very hectic on the filmmaking front, and I needed some time away just to, as I said before in my updated video, needed some time away to kind of reassess this podcast, the direction of it, figure out some new ideas for episodes, new concepts. But giving it a lot of thought, I think I had enough time to kind of think things through, recharge my batteries, and finally return to you guys with my thoughts, my trivia, and my memories of the movie licensed toy lines that I grew up with. And I'm excited to bring about the new stuff that I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next couple weeks this particular season. So I wanted to kick things off on a solo episode on a particular toy line that didn't last very long, and yet it was a pretty popular franchise, even though it may be seen as more of a guilty pleasure back in the 80s and early 90s. What I'm talking about here is Police Academy. Yes, that same Police Academy starring Steve Guttenberg, Bubba Smith, Bobcat Goldthwait, a series of comedians, legends like Michael Winslow. And I just wanted to get into this one because this follows into a particular trend back then in the 80s when R-rated movies got translated into cartoons, comic books, and of course action figures. And Police Academy was a very interesting one, going as far back as that original 1984 film, which I did not see until the animated series, which we'll talk about in a bit because that will tie into today's topic. But the original 84 film was cashing in on the success of a lot of teen sex romps like Porky's and also Private Resort and all those other like teen sex romps of the time, but also The Animal House, National Lampoon's Vacation, all of these wild, off the wall comedies, the screwball comedies of that time that were pushing boundaries and had no political correctness about them, compared to today's times. And everything about it was just inventive. Every character in those films was just so unique. Steve Guttenberg's character, Kerry Mahoney, he was the prankster. He was the one that was doing everything humanly possible to get out of the academy, and pull all kinds of schemes around his superior or his instructor, Harris, played by G.W. Bailey, to try to get himself out. And Harris, of course, would become a nemesis throughout the entire Police Academy series. Along the way, you have all these colorful characters. You have Michael Winslow's Larvell Jones, the big motor mouth who could do all kinds of crazy voices with his mouth, and is essentially the trademark of Michael Winslow's act. And over time, he also brought about his martial arts abilities into the series, and that became a big component to his character. You had Tackleberry, who was the big gun nut that everybody was trying to calm down because he just wanted to go out there and shoot up some shit. And then we learn later in the second movie that this guy is also a virgin who's afraid of girls until he finally meets his match and gets married. There was also other characters. Hooks, the one with the squeaky voice, but when you pissed her off, she would start to really have that loud, angry tone to her. Bubba Smith's Hightower, just this lovable big man that it was so intimidating, but yet he just loved to cut flowers. And, of course, Commandant Lassard, played by George Gaines of Punky Brewster fame, who was like the sweet commander, leader of the academy, kind of naive at many times, but also generated some of the biggest laughs because everything was over his head, and then some. So, those were like some of the key characters, as I recall, from the original film. And it was raunchy, it was wild, and it was a massive hit in its day in 1984. Now, throughout the rest of the 80s, you would have a sequel after sequel each year, and each film got played down and watered down as they were trying to market the jokes towards different territories around the world, because the films were more popular overseas than they were here in the States. Warner Brothers, after a while, is almost embarrassed to be making these movies as grosses were diminishing. But in spite of that, kids were always into these films, and they would have the better time than the adults on the PG centric sequels. So, without getting too heavy into every movie, Police Academy 2, their first assignment, that's when the graduates of the first movie now go on the street working in a precinct in an inner city area, and they have to take on the street gang led by Zed, played by Bobcat Goldthwait, somebody who was kind of embarrassed about doing these movies but saw it as a paycheck to help his family. And it was also the introduction of Sweet Chuck, played by Tim Kaczynski of Saturday Night Live fame, who was a store merchant that was constantly getting bullied and harassed by Goldthwait's gang. And then you have an interesting thing later in Police Academy 3 where those two characters, among other new characters, are now recruits, with the original cast now becoming instructors. So now those two guys end up becoming unlikely partners. And we see in that film how you have a rival, more military style academy that's rivaling the academy of the first film, and the city is going to undergo budget cuts, so they can only keep one academy, and they're basically competing against one another to show which one is the better school. Police Academy 4, Citizens on Patrol, that's the one that had like the big Motown soundtrack and Michael Winslow doing the theme song, which I used to think was the Fat Boys. Um, they were in the cartoon, by the way, and did the theme song for that. That was the one where it was sort of a rehash of 3. They took these average citizens and created like a neighborhood watch type of program called COP, Citizens on Patrol. And same deal, the cadets of the first movie are now instructing the citizens, and you get everybody having their little side plots here and there. There's a jailbreak at the end. There's climax with hot air balloons. There's like a skateboard scene which features a very young Tony Hawk doubling for David Spade when nobody knew who he was. That was Police Academy 4 in a nutshell. The fifth film is the one where they go to Miami Beach and there's a caper. I think Lassard mixes up his luggage with the villain, and then the villain tries to kidnap him. Steve Guttenberg was gone at that point, so they had this other actor, Matt McCoy, playing Lassard's nephew. He becomes the new Mahoney of the story. Police Academy 6, which was the last film in that decade, was more story based. That's where you have like this crime wave in the city, and the villains are being led by this mysterious Mr. Big figure. The main thugs in the movie have like the traits of Jones and Hightower and Tackleberry. And then there wasn't another movie for some time until 1994, the 10th anniversary of the original, when you got Police Academy Mission to Moscow, where now you had the characters, or what was left of the actors willing to return, going to Moscow to work with the Russian police to take on Ron Perlman, playing this Russian mobster using a Game Boy that's basically a device for nuclear weapons, some craziness like that. It was just really absurd, and I remember it was so horrible that it barely got released in the States. I think it just came out at a couple of discount theaters and went straight to video. In the process of this, there was a live action TV series in the 90s that didn't last very long. But before that, we had an animated series that came out in syndication in 1988. And as a kid, I remember seeing the ads for the later Police Academy movies from 4 to 6. But really, my interest in it came about because of the animated series, which I used to watch right here on Channel 11 every afternoon when I would come home from school. I would stay at my grandparents' place until my parents got home from work. So it would be on, and it was just like anything else at that time. I was just like really hooked into it. All the stories, had the humor of the later films that were more kid friendly. There were more villains that were recurring week after week. There was even one episode where all the villains kind of teamed up against the Academy. You even had like a group of talking dogs that would also have like their special episodes. The cartoon was produced by Ruby Spears Productions, the company behind the likes of Centurions and Alvin and the Chipmunks. Only lasted one season on the air. I think when they aired it a second season, it was just repeats of the last 60 some odd episodes that were produced. So it wasn't very long. Marvel did a comic book for a short run. In the course of the cartoon's run, Kenner decided to cash in on the cartoon, and they started making Police Academy action figures. Now, just like with Ghostbusters, there's going to be that whole discussion about, well, we're reviewing toys based on a cartoon, based on a movie. I don't care. This is still a film based franchise. It still connects with what this podcast is about, and it's about movie licensed toys. So here we go. So we begin with the first wave of figures that came out in late 1988, which was about, I'd say, 8 figures altogether. So we had Carrie Mahoney, who came with a gun, a nightstick. They try to capture like the coolness and the hipness of Steve Guttenberg's character, so he could like twirl the gun, twirl the nightstick, and he would have the hole in his hand, which could easily break. I gotta say, when you're trying to stick the thing into his thumb. And he came with the dog Samson that would squirt water. So you put water in it and you squeeze it. It's like a little plush dog. It squirts out water. I'd say of all the figures, this might have captured the best likeness of the character in the film, being that the design in the cartoon was totally off of Steve Guttenberg. Other than the fact that his hair is more lighter than Guttenberg's actual hair, it's still pretty good, and I think it was like the common figure within the line. You also had Larvell Jones, the Michael Winslow character. He would be dressed in like a regular Police Academy t-shirt with sweatpants. He had a bullhorn. His mouth could move. So like if you want to pretend he was doing the motor mouth things, like you could be a kid and pretend like you're Michael Winslow. So, like you could do like those little voices with that. You have the radio. It totally fits his character. I'm pretty sure Michael Winslow has a couple of these in his home. And he has the red bandana because in the movies, he would get into the karate scenes. So that kind of added to like sort of like his Bruce Lee fanaticism. Then you had Hightower, the Bubba Smith character. He doesn't have the facial hair like Bubba Smith, but he has that tallness. He's probably one of the more taller figures in the line. Very much like the lanky arms, the legs can move, and he came with like a little scooter. So it was like part of the whole gag that he was this big guy in a little vehicle. That was pretty much the Hightower figure. Then you had Zed, the character that Bob Kickley played in the film. They kind of made him more wild in the cartoon than they did in the movie. So, like his hair's messed up, his uniform is totally ripped up. He comes with a skateboard, whether that's supposed to be like some nod to Police Academy 4, I'm not sure. I don't remember Bobcat Goldthwait riding a skateboard in any of the movies. He had the ripped up hat that he could put on his head, and his pants can drop. I don't know why. I mean, that probably is enough to say, like, Bobcat Goldthwait was embarrassed to be in these movies. But yeah, his pants would drop, even though that really wasn't anything that happened in the movie or in the cartoon. I think Zed was a little bit cooler than that. That should have been saved for Captain Harris or even Proctor, who they did not make. And I'll get to those later on. You also had Tackleberry, and Tackleberry in the cartoon compared to the movie, they really went over the top with him. Being that he was a gun nut, it's like, okay, in the movies, David Graff, the late great David Graff, who played the part, he was trying to do like his own Dirty Harry type of spin. He was almost militarized. Sometimes you'd see him dress up like he's Rambo. Sometimes he'd be filmed like he's Clint Eastwood, But in the cartoon, They put him in a SWAT uniform. They gave him a helmet. He rarely ever took off the helmet and the visor. In the toy, they have the helmet. You could take the visor off. He has a bulletproof vest. And he also, they give him guns. They give him like a 44 Magnum. They gave him a bazooka and what looks like a flamethrower, of all things. So, yeah, I mean, you talk about really capturing the essence of that guy. They captured it perfectly here. And then you had three villains, all of which were in the animated series, and none of them were in the movie. You had the character of Numbskull, who was like the conehead looking thug. They would give him like two weapons that you could put over his head. One was like a drill, the other one was like a hammerhead type of thing. And you could actually like squeeze his arm, and his head would be used as a battering ram. I think like the villains were definitely in combatants with Hasbro with the cops figures that we mentioned in the RoboCop episode, even though they're not exact, but it's sort of like almost as if they were trying to make a parody of that to some extent. You also had the character Mr. Sleaze, who was kind of a strange villain. He was like a sleazy bad guy in a suit. His tie could pop up and shoot gas, although it didn't really shoot gas. It was just the gag that he could pull up the tie when you squeezed his legs. He had this little foo-foo dog, like a little poodle, and then you could put like a cover over it to make it look so innocent, but then when you take it off, I guess it's supposed to be like this rabid dog. I used to think the Mr. Sleaze character was based on the villain in Police Academy 5, who was played by one of the actors from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. They're totally different characters, but I used to like to think that that was the same guy. And lastly, in the line, you had a cat burglar named Claw. And he came with this backpack propeller so he could, like, I guess fly into buildings. And then he came with a cat called Mauser, who was like this kind of like crazy looking alley cat that I guess, like, you could put rope over it because there's like a little hole that you could probably lift it up and hang around some stuff like a fishing pole. Interestingly enough, the propeller thing that Claw comes with was also later recycled and repainted for the Batman Dark Knight collection. They would repaint it for the Joker to do like a flying Joker action figure. And you would notice that this would happen a lot throughout the Police Academy line. The second series got a little more interesting. So we finally get Captain Harris, G.W. Bailey's role, but instead of releasing it in stores, you only got it as a mail away figure, and these are very rare. I was fortunate enough to get enough coupons from the past figures to get the Captain Harris back when they were releasing these toys. And Harris came with a couple of accessories. He had a hat that apparently is supposed to be like glued on, and then when you take it off, a part of the hat is still left on his nearly bald head. He wasn't bald in any of the movies, but it was kind of like a little sight gag that I recall from that. I think it's similar to the gag in the second movie with Art Matreno's character Mauser when they put crazy glue on his hands as he's showering, replacing it with the shampoo, and then he gets his hand stuck on his hair. When he gets it off, it's like all this hair that's on his hand. It's probably one of the best jokes in the movie because he's like, he's confronting all the Academy members, like, who did this? You see all that the hair on his hands, and Gutenberg is like, you need to stop that, sir. You could go blind. When I saw that joke again a few years ago, I was like, holy shit, I get that reference, and it's so R-rated. I'm not even going to talk more about it right now. People will get sick. Okay, so other than that, Harris had his trademark cane, and he had these binoculars that if you press onto the white side of the binoculars, his eyes are supposed to pop out. So that was Harris in a nutshell. I'd say maybe the second best likeness to the actors in the film, since he was supposed to resemble G.W. Bailey. So that was that. In that same set, you also had a new Tackleberry figure in more of a SWAT team uniform and like a riot gear helmet that you could flip over. he comes with a fistzuka, as they call it. And as I mentioned in our very first podcast, the same fistzuka was also later used in the Batman Dark Knight collection for the Joker. Joker would also have like a fist bazooka that you could hit Batman with. That's the same accessory right there. You also had a new Larvell Jones. This time he's in a karate suit, karate gi, and he would have what they call a kicker pack. So it would be like a backpack that you put over Jones, and the backpack it was like a mechanical device that could do punches and kicks. So it was almost like a precursor to those deluxe figures that Kenner would do for Star Wars and other toy lines in the 90s, where they wanted to jack up the prices, so make the same figure but give them bigger accessories. That's what this was back then. And with villains, we had the martial arts bad guy called Flung He. There were two versions of this figure that had an orange belt and a yellow belt. Both figures had the ability to do a swinging arm and came with nunchucks and this whirly thing. So that was really all I could say about that. And then you had essentially the main villain of the cartoon series, the Kingpin. And yeah, it was supposed to be like some nod or knockoff of the Marvel Comics Kingpin, because he would always escape in every episode. So he was like the one that always would get away. The Kingpin had like he was kind of like this colorful looking bad guy. He was bald like the Marvel Comics Kingpin. He had a thief safe trap, which would basically protect his loot, so the safe would snap shut and protect his shit. So that was the Kingpin. Probably the more serious figure in the Police Academy toy line, and maybe even sort of a throwback to the Mr. Big villain in Police Academy 6. Then you had the last figures in the line, as they called Special Assignment Rookies. So here you had a new Kerry Mahoney in a undercover setup. He had a hoodlum disguise, so like you would have this mask with a fake beard and a hat that you could put over his face. He had a boombox, handcuffs, which I guess, you put the boombox over the bad guy's hands and he would be handcuffed to them. This hidden sonic blaster, like all this James Bond type stuff. I mean, they make Mahoney look more like a badass. He's got a t-shirt with a gun holster. There's a vest you could put over him. And I always believed that this figure was a homage to Steve Guttenberg. When he's playing Mahoney in Police Academy 2, he has to go undercover as one of the thugs. So they put him in like this punk outfit and fake facial hair to try to infiltrate Bobcat Goldthwait's gang. This was probably a throwback to that, the way that I believe. Then you had a new Zed. This time he had a sky glider. So he would actually have this glider that you could attach to his back. He'd be dressed up like he's gliding, and a spinning beanie cap. And I think this was in the animated series, so this was sort of like a throwback to that. You also had the character of House, who debuted in Police Academy 4, later returned to Police Academy 5. He was played by Tab Tacker, probably best known from the Goldie Hawn movie Wildcats. And he was another rare figure that I didn't get until I found it in a flea market years later. They capture his size, even though he's a lot more thinner than he is in the cartoon, so they kind of like compress his stomach a bit. And they play up to the fact that, hey, he loves food, so he has a snack attack accessory, like this big sandwich, and I guess he's supposed to shoot it or something. I never got the accessory because, like I said, I bought the figure loose, but it was one of those rare figures to find in the store. And then lastly, we had Sweet Chuck, the Tim Kaczynski character, who's like probably the smallest figure in the whole line because they made him like a midget, just like in the cartoon. So Sweet Chuck, they gave him like a vest. He had a baseball cap. He had this flashlight that you couldn't take out of his hand. It's like stuck to his hand. And his big thing was they have him going disguising as a fire hydrant. So you put this yellow fire hydrant over him and he fits it. This was also one, like Harris, it was one of the most rare figures in the line. And there was a point where when they ran out of Captain Harris figures in the mail away, They would also substitute it with Sweet Chuck. So Sweet Chuck was very hard to get in the store. You were lucky if you were able to find it. Fortunately, I was able to get it as a mail away, and I would say it's also one of the more expensive figures, along with Harris, in the line. Vehicles were interesting too. So we had the Crazy Cruiser. That was where you have the Police Academy car that could split apart into two. So like the cab of it in the back could split back in case like the car would malfunction and the criminal could escape. And weirdly enough, it would have like this little guy that would come out of the hood, which I used to think was Proctor, which is Harris's right hand man, but it wasn't. It was just like some random mechanic dude. So again, adding to the gag of the Police Academy movies, and you could only fit just two figures. It was just like the Dick Tracy car. You could only have one figure in the front, one figure in the back. If you want to have more, you were screwed. Then you had the Crash Cycle, which was the Police Academy motorcycle, and this one was specifically designed for Zed, because I guess he was the only one. Well, he wasn't the only one that drove the bike in the cartoon, but because his hands could were pretty much sideways, he could actually be the one to fit onto the bike, and the bike was designed to essentially crash. Like it could break apart. It has an ejector seat. That was that. It was like a training wheel cycle. Hell, it had training wheels on the back. So those were the two that were released in the line. And probably the best thing that they had was the Precinct, the Police Academy playset. So this one had, I say, would rival the Ghostbusters Firehouse. Not as tall as the Firehouse, but bigger in width. So you had like the same type of doors that the Firehouse had, but they were painted blue. There are all kinds of traps and contraptions with this. So you had like the jail that could slide and spring load. You had a little lineup sticker that you could put onto the top of the building. There's a breakaway wall. There's a ladder. There's a gun on the top of the roof. So you had all kinds of stuff. And the ladder could swing too. So you had all kinds of little things, exercise rings, again, adding to the fact that, hey, Police Academy was all about the jokes, it was about the gags. So, if you want to have your action, you want to have your Police Academy guys trying to take down bad guys and do it in a comedic way, this is your setup. That was it for Police Academy. There really wasn't that much else. But there were a lot of things that were listed in the back of the cards on the second line that never came out. And some of the stuff, surprisingly enough, did come out, but not in the United States. One was the Copper Corner. This came out in Argentina, as I found out later finding some of these figures on eBay. So the Copper Corner was the second playset in the Police Academy line, and it really was not a big playset. It was like a mini playset. So this was like little, like almost like a corner front that you could jail the bad guy in. It looked like a phone booth, similar to the Bill and Ted phone booth. So I guess you'd have the bad guy go in it, and then you could trap them. There's a little mailbox, so I guess if you wanted to put Sweet Chuck in there, that's where he would hide, like a little disguise. So that was like the second place that we never got. We also were supposed to get a number of other vehicles that were listed but not produced. One was the four-wheel basher, which looks like the little beach dune buggy from Police Academy 2. That had a couple of little devices and things that you could knock out bad guys with. There was the crime mulcher, which looks like a golf cart with helicopter propellers on top. I don't know who that was for. I'm assuming it might have been intended for Hightower. And a couple of other toys that were displayed at Toy Fair but didn't get produced. One was the Bruiser Cruiser vehicle, and I'm pretty sure this might have been intended for Tackleberry. This was like this wild, almost like a monster truck that would have a battering ram in the front. It had like a little cap on top if you want to get the guys to look like they were coming in and out of it from the top. And lastly, there was the Jail Jalopy vehicle, which also was displayed at Toy Fair back then. So this was like another Police Academy vehicle similar to the police car, but this was a truck, and on the back there was a little jail cell that you could lock away the villains in. And yes, the cage door can open and the back area rocks from side to side. So that way the villain could escape very easily and the jail cell could fall off. That was it for Police Academy, guys. There really wasn't much else. I would assume like Bill and Ted, because the cartoon didn't really fly, kids were not really big into it the way they were with Ghostbusters or Ninja Turtles or any of the others. And maybe I would even get a little bit political and say that there's a lot of anti-cop sentiment back then in the 80s that maybe kids, especially in lower income communities, probably did not want to buy toys about cops, whether they were funny or not. So that was really it. And unfortunately, there were a lot of characters left out that we never got as figures. And that's pretty much where I would leave it in terms of toys we never got that we should have. You know, we never got Callahan, Leslie Easterbrook's character, who, you know, was like the big vixen blonde in the Police Academy series. Almost had like kind of a dominatrix kind of way about her, but when they did the cartoon, they made her like basically a female Tackleberry. She would have been cool to have because you could have made a badass figure with some big guns to it, no pun intended. The glasses and all. So we never got her. We never got Hooks. You know, she could have been the same size as Sweet Chuck and was just as much part of the group as everybody else. And 9 times out of 10, I would have to take those female toys from other lines like Ninja Turtles and others and pretend those were the characters. Like I would take the Guinan from Star Trek and pretend it was Hooks. You know, that's pretty much what I had to do to fill in the gaps. We never got Commandant Lassard. I think he could have been a better mail-away figure to Captain Harris. We never got Proctor. We never got Captain Harris's bumbling sidekick. He would have been another one that would have been so much fun to have, and he should have been the figure to have his pants fall down, because that's what happens to him virtually in every movie. You know, you had the one scene in the third film where he gets tricked by that hooker to take his clothes off and then locks him out of his hotel room. And he's running around the streets naked till he's in the Blue Oyster Club. So, you know, like, we didn't get all those guys. And there were more of the dog characters that weren't there. There were more villains from the animated series we should have had. And if you want to even go further, there were so many other characters in the movies that probably could have been translated in toy form and in animated form. But that was that. You know, it really wasn't a big line that sold that well. But nonetheless, it still adds to the craze of taking R-rated movies and making action figures out of them back then before we got politically correct. And I had fun with these, you know, and they were like, my interest in Police Academy was always in and out. So, you know, it's just a shame that we didn't get the others, but I had fun with the ones that we had at that time. And of course, there's always been discussions over the years about another Police Academy movie, whether to remake it or do a full-blown reboot. I know at one time Key and Peele were in talks of remaking Police Academy, but I would say after Peele did Get Out, that pretty much was a done deal. That wasn't going to happen with those guys. As we know, like many of the actors reunited for the movie La Valantula and its sequel on the Sci-Fi Channel. And there's going to be a documentary coming out soon, What an Institution, and many of the surviving cast members are going to be back doing interviews and retrospectives about everything Police Academy, from the films to the animated series to the television series, and they will be discussing the action figures. So I am really excited to be seeing that once that's completed. I know they just recently got Steve Guttenberg interviewed after months of negotiations, so it just makes it that much better, and it's probably going to be the definitive documentary for all things Police Academy. They even got Bobcat Goldthwait to come back, so that tells you something right there. So that is it for Police Academy, and that just kicks off what's going to be a very interesting season of the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. As always, you can follow us on Facebook, like us there for all updates, news. You could even see all the little trivia and updates on current action figure lines that are out there. You can follow us on Twitter at SilverScreenAF1. And if you want to email us with any thoughts, ideas, comments, suggestions for new episodes, contact me at silverscreenafpodcast@gmail.com. All right, guys. Hope you had fun with this one, and I'll see you at the movies.